If I were to make a prediction about what the buzzword is going to be in popular neuroscience in the next 5 years, it's not the amygdala, it's not the prefrontal cortex, it's the insula. In other words, in the absence of an insula and a prefrontal cortex conversation, really the only thing an animal or human needs to do is just respond to their arousal in, it's either, you can either retreat, you can stay put, or you can fight. Some people have probably heard of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. That naming is a little bit misleading. Again, what we can really think about the autonomic nervous system as is a continuum, or more like a seesaw, of at one end is alertness, and at the other end is calmness. Right? That is translated to the so-called sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, but I'll call it the alertness and calmness system just for sake of simplicity. So it's sort of like a seesaw, and it has different neural circuits, and basically whether or not you feel very alert or panicked or alert but calm or a little bit of anxiety, that's going to depend on the balance between this alertness system and the calmness system. If you're having a full-blown panic attack, then the alertness system is, it's as if the seesaw is tilted all that way. If you have, if you're deeply asleep, well, then the calmness system is really tilted down. You could say that's a portion of the seesaw. This is all kind of obvious and dates back, 100 years or so, which isn't that long in the history of science, but we've known this sort of thing for a while. Okay, what's interesting and I think more relevant nowadays is to think about one's own interpretation of those signals and how that relates to anxiety and, as you pointed out, exploration, and then to think about where the nodes of control are. In this seesaw model that I'm putting forward, the seesaw has to include what I would call a hinge, a location in the middle in which you can voluntarily adjust the seesaw to either be more tilted toward alert or more tilted toward asleep. And for many people, they find that their overall level of autonomic arousal is either inappropriate or inadequate for the demands of their life. Inappropriate meaning their heart is racing, they feel more jittery, more as if movement would be the default and worry would be the default and anticipation is the default than is appropriate for their circumstances. Waking up in the morning and feeling stressed, for instance, immediately without any immediate cause or maybe stress about real life events. For other people, they feel more exhausted than they would like. They're having a hard time leaning into the pressures of daily life. Both of those, even though they have sort of polarized phenotypes, they look very different. In one case, over-energized, and in one case, under-energized. Both originate within the autonomic nervous system. And we can reliably say from work done in animals and humans that that is not the consequence of the alertness system or the calmness system being disrupted, but rather that hinge in the middle is dysregulated. And we now know what that hinge is based on work done by colleagues of mine at Stanford, in particular a guy named David Spiegel, who's our associate chair of psychiatry. He's done a lot of work, and it's actually his father did a lot of work in the application of clinical hypnosis, not stage hypnosis, but clinical hypnosis for the treatment of various things. But his work and some work in our laboratory now has shown that there's an area of the brain that you are familiar with, Dr. Peterson, which is the prefrontal cortex, and in particular, the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, if you really want to get down in the weeds about it, that has direct communication with two brain areas that are absolutely critical for this issue of whether or not you feel right for your circumstances, whether or not you translate that into a curiosity and exploration, or whether or not you translate it into this thing that we call anxiety. And those two areas are called the anterior cingulate cortex. Again, I apologize for all the names, but the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula.
Physical state you're in so that you could predicate your plans on that. You think the insula, at least in part, is responsible for formulating those representations or for reporting those representations.
That is exactly right. In fact, the animal data and the human data, both lesion data and reversible inactivation data, support that in humans. So you have that exactly right. And as you mentioned, the prefrontal cortex, it gets sort of thrown out there for everything. I think, nowadays people have probably heard of the prefrontal cortex and people hear about executive function, which of course is true. But if we were to really dial back and say, what is the prefrontal cortex in the position to do? It's a flexible rule-setting structure. How do we know that? I'm sure you are probably more familiar than I am with the classic Stroop task. You give somebody a bunch of cards with different words on them, and those words are written in different colors. And you tell the person, okay, just read the words to me. Ignore the color that they're written in, just read them. And so they're saying they're cat, dog, shelf, book, professor, student, etc. Then you quickly change the rules and you say, you know what, just tell me the color that the words are written in, but ignore what the words say. And people will do that, but there's a portion of time in which they slow down a bit. It's actually hard because you've done a rule switch. Much of life, as you know, and again, this is more your domain than mine, is about applying different rules in different contexts. Now, what we know is that the insula and the prefrontal cortex are both intimately involved in this conversation that establishes which rules are appropriate for a given situation. So for instance, if somebody were to say something that quote unquote triggers me, okay, I'll use myself as the example, right? Maybe someone will tweet something and I'll think, and I immediately want to respond in a way that I know I can kind of flip them on their back immediately. But then I think, maybe I want to refrain from that for any number of different rules or reasons, right? Well, then I'm starting to apply different rules. I'm starting to think about the context that's outside of the autonomic response. Because in a strict, very animalistic way, in other words, in the absence of an insula and a prefrontal cortex conversation, really the only thing an animal or human needs to do is just respond to their arousal in, it's either you can either retreat, you can stay put, or you can fight.